I would like to welcome Mrs. Linda Sokačová. She also has a presentation, so I would like to ask for the presentation to be uploaded. I'm going to introduce her briefly. She's the director of Amnesty International Czech Republic. She's been working for many years in the area of social work. So Linda, the floor is yours. So good morning. Thank you very much to the organizational team of Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs for organizing this conference and for having me. And before I move to the presentation itself, I would like to thank and express my admiration to all social workers because this work is hard under normal circumstances that perhaps none of us remembers, and sometimes it's impossible, almost impossible during the COVID times. So thank you very much. And for the organizers, I would just like to say that I can hear other people speaking in my headphones. Maybe you're thinking, what am I doing here? What's Amnesty International doing here? Our organization, which is a global institution, it focuses on education in human rights, and we're most famous for pushing on releasing people from prisons who are imprisoned for the support of human rights. But not many people know that Amnesty has been recently focused on cultural and social rights. We focused on labor conditions in various disciplines. And last year we focused on the COVID crisis and its effect on human rights. And one of the essential areas that we identified globally is the right to gather, right for freedom of expression. And these rights have been impacted, and also the labor or work rights of employees in health and social work, as well as their clients, have been impacted, and that's something I'm going to talk about in my presentation. So I just want you explaining why Amnesty International is present at this conference today. Social work is considered to be a human right profession, and the Federation of Social Workers mentions human dignity in the international definition of human rights, and it's one of the reasons why it is important to talk about or focus on the human dignity and human rights, although it is very complicated. And sometimes it can be very abstract, the concept of human rights. Unfortunately, not just in the Czech Republic, human rights are marginalized, not only in social services and social work, but since the 1989, we tend to deal with all the other issues, economics and the aspect of economy. But human rights, we don't have much time and strength and resources left for it. Unfortunately, the disinterest of the human rights topic very negatively affects the conditions of employees working in social services, as well as their clients. And I believe that you are experiencing it during the current times, as the COVID crisis uncovered many of these issues and actually deepened them, unfortunately. As I mentioned, social work is interconnected with human rights because the values it's built on, and you already heard about them from Mrs. Štěpánková. The elementary values are respect, dignity, and self-determination. Of course, the values, the social work, or the approach of social workers is based on keeps developing. It keeps developing very progressively, very quickly. And recently, there are other values or approaches important in social works and principles that the work of social workers is based on. One of them is participation. Participation and involvement of social work clients. It deepens and improves the area of support and using or the application of human rights, because the clients themselves are involved in it. They can reflect on the different solutions that social workers present them with. Undiscrimination and diversity are also important topics. Diversity is very important, has been very important topic recently. It's related with identity, self-determination of clients, of social work or social services. Specifically in abroad, they talk about social work and the specifics of social work and social services for people from the LGBT community, etc. There are also other important principles and values, such as transparency and responsibility, responsibility of social workers, the transparency of all individual processes that are important for the provision of social work. Speaking about human rights and human dignity in social work, we often come across dilemmas such as, I called it paternalism versus accompanying social work, and I believe that all high-quality social workers follow this and work in this way, rather accompany their clients. They introduce different solutions for their situation and they try to motivate them. But it's not so long ago, and unfortunately in some countries and in certain specific areas of social work or social services, it's still something present, that's paternalism, and that's an approach based on basically telling clients what to do, how to behave, regardless of how they themselves fall into the solution, how motivated they are, how much they are suited for such given solution with regards to, for example, their personal nature. And then we are in danger of certain failure that's attributed to the client. Another dilemma related to human rights and human dignity is, I again called it judgment versus solution. And I think it's again applicable in the social work area, not just in the Czech Republic. We tend to judge the way people interested in social work, how did they, instead of judging how they got into the situation they got into, it is more important to look for solutions. Of course, it is always important to reflect on why certain situation occurred, but it should not be the basis for the solution, for the approach to the client, because it can have a negative impact on his or her human dignity. In abroad, as well as in the Czech Republic, you know, and former colleagues, my former colleagues from the Division of Social Work could talk a lot about this. The ministry was contemplating about a special act focused on social work, certain countries follow this path, but what's very important is ethical codes and professional organizations. That was also a topic of the bill that we were working on social work. But some of these voluntary, sometimes less voluntary professional organizations demand that their members adhere to human rights, that they adhere to the human dignity principles that in practice we often don't have too much time for. But the topic of human rights is very important, especially in specific social services, such as certain residential social services, where there can be specific situations, especially when there is some kind of isolation taking place and things related to violation of certain social rights of employees in social services. And unfortunately, we know that especially in the Czech Republic, the conditions of employees in social work and social services are not that they would deserve. In practice, we come across with violation of human rights, both on the side of social workers as well as on the side of the people who are the consumers of social work and social services, or beneficiaries. As I said, in the Czech Republic, a great topic is labor and occupational conditions with regards to the salary, which when we compare it to other disciplines, it's quite low, especially when we consider the educational requirements as well as requirements for lifelong education, long-term education, because social work is an area where people need to educate themselves continuously. It is also prescribed to them by law. The question is how it is reflected in A, salaries, and B, all the other benefits that they can obtain within the system. It is closely related also to the prestige of this occupation and awareness of what social workers do. Very often, unfortunately, there's still the notion, the idea of a social work that used to work before 1989 at the Department of Child Protection. We see it in movies, and it has a negative effect on the image, because then people are scared to contact social workers. And of course, the topic of human rights is very important. I would even say the most important, although I don't want to degrade the work of social workers, but their human rights should be very important. Social workers should support motivation of their clients to actively make them participate and be involved in solution of their situations, especially the problematic situations that occur in residential social services. As for example, Život 90, Life 90, they apply the methods of self-reporting. The employees in these different institutions or facilities, they assess how they develop individual plans for their clients, but they can also self-report on situations where they assume they didn't behave correctly in the area of human rights, human dignity, and also the area of violence or misbehavior towards their clients. And the objective of the self-reporting is not to punish, but on the contrary to point out the situation, that there is something problematic. So this is totally different approach. I'm sorry, I'm hearing somebody else speaking, but not the presenter. So again, I would like to warn the organizers that I can hear somebody else. So in my headphones. So my apologies if you didn't hear them. It's upsetting me a bit. Same applies to the interpreters. So this is a message to the social workers how to prevent certain situations. It's not about punishment, but about prevention. Another thing that would be good to use in social work is the work of inspection of social services. That they should also deal with the issues of human rights much more, and specific violations, especially if they get into more extreme forms. It should be again a topic that's going to be dealt with more by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs and other stakeholders, city councils, local authorities. But we are at the very beginning of dealing with this issue, so we cannot perhaps ask the stakeholders to deal with this. But firstly, we should give them tools how to do it. Now, very briefly, I would like to mention a study that's been done by Amnesty in Belgium, Italy, Spain, and Great Britain. And in all these 4 countries, the analysis focused on the topic of impact of COVID and COVID measures on human rights in residential care homes, old people care homes. I would like to sum up some of the findings, and I believe that many of them we can say that many of them we saw in the Czech Republic as well. There are some country specifics, but certain findings are quite general and can be applied to all participating countries. One of the main findings, quite primitive but very key, was that social services were not a priority for the government, for the stakeholders of the COVID situation, and as opposed to hospitals, who the focus was on. I'm not saying that the focus should not be on hospitals, but in social services there are just as vulnerable people living there. It was reflected in lack of personal protective tools. They didn't. The social workers didn't have them. There was lack of testing, and now we could also we can see it in vaccination, especially in the Czech Republic. The countries failed in the approach to protection of social workers, and in all countries there was quite a high morbidity related to COVID-19, It was also reflected in the state of the clients in the care homes, and unfortunately in many countries there was a rejection of care by hospitals. And I think it happened also in the Czech Republic that patients were moved from hospitals to care homes in a state where we didn't know whether they're still infected with COVID-19 or not, whether they can spread it or not, which contributed to a great increase of infection rate amongst clients as well as carers or workers in care homes, and that also was reflected in a great mortality in these care homes. There was a violation of the right for private life. There was a logical measure of a lockdown of care homes, but on the other hand, it meant great isolation for the residents of these care homes. They couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't meet with anybody, which brought about great mental issues that further affected their physical states. In some of the studies, there was a right to dignified death, which they talk about this as part of the hospice care, but many people are dealing with a trauma that they couldn't be with their loved ones at the time when they were dying. On one hand, it's understandable. On the other hand, we are people, and we need to consider these things. And what's a big issue, that in all these countries, they didn't have good quality data with regards to COVID and residential services. Here in the presentation, I believe if you receive this presentation, you have references to these studies so that you can look at them, and an extra link to study on inclusion. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for your work once again. So thank you very much to the director of Amnesty International Czech Republic for this very important contribution that put social work in context with human rights, which is very important, especially at these times. There are some issues that arise, as we heard. Also, thank you very much for the final presentation of the studies. Now we're moving to the block of questions. We have 10 minutes. These studies that Mrs. Sokačová presented at the end, they may contrast with, be in contrast with what we heard from Israel, where social services opened up very early. Quite early, and there was a great emphasis. I would like to ask Mrs. Iris Florentin from Israel. Now I'm getting a signal from our directors that I should not ask any questions. I see. So Mrs. Iris Florentin is not connected at this time. We are very sorry about that, but we can't ask this question. So what questions do we have in our system? There is a big thanks for the topic of human rights. That does not sound very good on a political scene, political platform. Now I would like to ask the support team, do we have any other questions? I would like to ask Mrs. Sokačová, from practice, it's a similar question that I wanted to ask the Deputy Director General from the Israel Ministry. It's about the overload of social workers during the COVID times with all these measures, and the pressure is great. There is a great pressure on clients. But when it comes down to overload, when they have to, the social workers need to adapt to new conditions and all the ad hoc situation, Linda, do you have any observation how to deal with burnout, how to deal with the issue of adaptation of the entire system as well as the individuals?
Well, I have no personal observation, nevertheless based on the researches and surveys that were made based on quite demanding methodology in all involved countries. It shows there was no time even for the standard work with employees because crisis situations had to be handled with priority, so there was no time for standard procedures such as in supervision, psychological support of employees, and so on. So they are highlighting this issue. Lack of support to support of employees in the first wave, and in the second wave in autumn, because they focused on those periods. But at the same time, nobody works with the employees within that period where the biggest crisis were overcome, and there may be some post-traumatic stress disorders because number of social workers experienced a lot of death, and only little facilities are solving dying with their employees' deaths. Thank you very much. It is important to say it loud because it belongs there. Currently, we have no other questions. We only have a little technical comments that time to time you hear other discussions. So we apologize for that. We constantly tune up technical parameters of the conference. Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite you for the break, and please be back 10:25. So let's see you later on. Thank you very much.